Yay. Okay, you are being recorded, so don't say anything bad.
Okay, I'll start.
Yes, I have many whiteboards, and so you can just direct me to do whatever you want me to do.
Okay, cool. I may at the end have a couple students hop on the whiteboard.
Wait a minute, say it again. Wait a minute, I'm sorry. Hold on, I can't hear.
Okay.
Try it again.
I may have a couple students at the
problem is there's background noise, so I can't hear you.
Oh, okay.
Excuse me for 1 second. Because it sounds coming out of the loudspeaker, I can hear Lyndon. She's just asking me questions. So just give me 1 second. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Try it again.
Oh, okay. I was going to have a few students hop on a whiteboard at the end to
Got it. Okay.
map out. So maybe you could like pivot the laptop.
Yep. So you can look. Yep.
Cool. That sounds great.
We'll make this like a robotic stand.
Yeah. I wish I was there.
Although it would be better if you had a joystick so that you could direct it.
Yeah, I know. Okay.
Perfect. I'm going to put you up on the big screen. Hold on. That's so weird. I did not answer your email because there was a question. No, because there's a question that other people have some interesting answer right now. Smart, and it came up during my office hours. So I was like, oh, this is like one of those moments. Morning, everyone. Before I introduce Lyndon, two quick things. In office hours yesterday and with an email from Jack yesterday, I got a question asking for clarification about the prompt. At the end of the prompt, it says something about substantiate your analysis with examples from the text and from case examples. The key word in that is causing confusion, I think, is the word and. The idea is substantiate. This is not an opinion paper. We want you to use, primarily, we want to make sure that you're drawing from the substance of the course, which is like, what is the theory of change? What is a theory of change? What is the theory of change of the organization you've chosen? And particularly around the key elements that we've discussed in class, like the linking of activities to outcomes to impact. I mean, not to like be totally reductive, but like those are the things we emphasize in here. Those are the ones that we really want to make sure that you're demonstrating in this thing that you do that. So that word substantiate says draw from whatever you want to make that case not, and do it with all of these things. So I apologize. I think at the beginning of the class I said, whenever you write new prompts, you realize tiny little things that cause common confusion. That's one of them. We'll fix it. You know, this one to make that. Okay, in your way, right? And then the second thing I just wanted to say before I forget, it's in my mind. My mind is like a column with lots of holes. Tomorrow's section, we are going to be talking about peer health exchange, but through the lens of what we're talking about today. So in your preparing for section tomorrow, think about peer health exchange, think about the framework from Waters of System Change in the Kim article, think about what we did in class today. Our goal for tomorrow is to help you walk out of section with a better understanding of those concepts. I will not be at my section again tomorrow. After tomorrow, I have one more that I'm missing in November, but we will be in good, capable hands of Marie. And if anybody has any questions after section and you want to talk about them, please shoot me a note. Happy to talk to you either by phone or whatever you need. before I get started, any questions? About 3 years ago, I met Lyndon when she was still living here in Rhode Island, and I found out that Lyndon, well, I want to start out by saying I have a value, like something that like I live by, which is that I find huge benefit in meeting new people. It nourishes my soul, it nourishes my mind, and it's also often helpful to other people, which is great. But like, I do it because it's good for me, and it's often good for the other people. And I met Lyndon, I actually don't remember how we got initially connected, but then I found out that her consultancy, at the time it was with the Foresight Design Initiative, and now just in the last 2 weeks, she's gone out on her own to launch her own company, is about bringing system change methodology into community-based work. And I was like, really? Have you ever thought about that? Because I've been faking it for a few years, and I'm okay, but I'll bet you'd be better. And so this is, I think, the third time that Lyndon has taught this module for us. I will say it is a huge upgrade because she lives this and does this in her day-to-day work. And I like her work so much. I'm also having a side conversation with her about getting her involved as a trainer, supporter of the work at Eye to Eye, an organization I know that you know I'm involved with, but to actually train our CEO and our president in systems change methodology, helping them think about what our theory of change ought to be around system change at Eye to Eye, and then thinking about how that gets embedded in our work. So I'm going to, without further ado, introduce Lyndon and have her take it away. She's designed a very interactive session, including having you do some exercises on the whiteboard, which I think is kind of cool because we're going to like turn the computer around and see if she can supervise you from there. Anyway, it's all good. We're very excited. Anyway, Lyndon, welcome. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alan. I always appreciate that kind introduction. Can folks hear me okay? Even in the back row there? Sweet. Okay, cool. It is always such an honor to spend time with Alan's social entrepreneurship class. I also get a ton of value from the folks that I meet out of this class. Some have come to Chicago and served as interns for the organizations I've worked for, and there's a handful that I still stay in touch with years later. So I'm just really delighted by the crop of folks that Alan attracts to this class and the types of thinkers that you all are. So excited to connect with you all today. So as Alan mentioned, I usually try to make this super interactive. This is my first year not being there in person, so bear with me as we test how interactive we can get at a distance. So as Alan mentioned, I'm, oh, actually I wanna, yeah, I'll just reiterate the intro and then I'll want to get a sense of who's in the room there today. So I'm a systemic designer, and I just co-founded a new practice called Daylight, which is a Chicago-based strategy consulting practice that really seeks to build capacity for systems change. As Alan mentioned, he graciously invited me to sort of co-create what this session looks like for you all today. And it's, again, been awesome to be able to codify and share my insights and experience from doing this work daily. So I'd love to get a sense of who's in the room there today. And if folks don't mind sort of popcorning what major you are arriving at this class from, or graduate program.
We have some graduate MPAs, just a few raise of hands so that she can see it.
Cool. I'm an MPA too, so.
6 or 7. How many seniors?
Okay, great.
Okay.
Great.
How many public policy concentrators? concentrators is just lingo for major.
Thank
Trying
you.
to think of their other predominant majors. Do you guys remember? I don't remember.
Any like obscure majors? Any like anthropologists? Not to call you out.
Engineering.
Engineering.
Great. Yes.
Who's got an independent concentration here? Remind me what is?
Nutrition, psychology, and
Awesome.
Okay.
Awesome.
Anybody else want to shout out something that they think is peculiar? Who wants to volunteer to be peculiar with Valicenti?
Yeah, peculiar. I like that.
Go ahead.
I'm a lit arts major, so.
Literary arts. Good. Stefan?
Architecture.
Architecture.
Architecture. Holler.
Philosophy from Juan.
Oh, great.
Cognitive neuroscience.
Ooh.
Is that Julia? Yeah.
Awesome.
I'm still learning names. I'm sorry. All right. So now we know what peculiar is.
Yeah. No, that's great. I think it's.
Another way of cutting this. What about folks who are in humanities, just generally humanities? So that's about a 20% or a third. Social sciences. So, and maybe physical sciences and engineering, computer science.
Cool.
Yeah, so actually that's a minority. Yeah.
Awesome. I love the diversity that this this cohort represents. I think it's super important to work across disciplines and across sectors and across, perspectives. Systems change and systems thinking is really anchored in that cross-disciplinary collaboration and way of kind of blending our perspectives and worldviews. So this is a really nice microcosm of what this often looks like in practice. Thanks for sharing. So how many folks had a chance to read the assignment or the articles for today? Cool. No shame. I'm curious though, for folks who did, could anyone sort of like encapsulate a definition of systems thinking from what they read? I'd love to hear your thoughts on what this is all about.
Wants to venture a beginning of a definition.
It doesn't have to be like a solid, concise definition, but just a sense. Yeah.
Defining system as like a group of interdependent parts arranged in a particular way to serve a specific purpose.
Awesome. That is like, I couldn't have said it better myself. So really understanding how elements are interconnected and interrelated to serve and organized to serve a particular purpose. That's really well said. And one of the slides later is around Donella Meadows' definition, who's sort of one of the thought leaders around systems thinking, and she calls it a system is an interconnected set of elements that organize in a way that it fulfills a function and produces its own pattern of behavior over time. And I really love this definition, just as you articulated it, because it brings a kind of neutrality to understanding systems. Often in the discourse, you'll hear, whether we're talking about the education system or the healthcare system, we often talk about these systems as being broken, right? Have folks heard that kind of framing? Oh, the education system's broken, the criminal justice system's broken. And while that's, true, I agree. It often can make folks feel a little bit powerless over a broken system. But if we understand those systems as an interconnected set of elements that are serving a purpose, even if that purpose isn't resulting in the outcomes that we believe we should be striving for, it allows us to say, you know what, the system is serving a purpose. It's not the purpose we want. So let's get in there and redesign how those elements are interacting with one another. So it's a little bit more empowering to bring a neutral viewpoint to thinking about systems. Does that make sense? Cool. Thank you for sharing that definition. That's spot on. Cool. So I'm gonna the organization of today's sort of conversation is first starting with some of the conceptual ways of slicing and dicing systems thinking and systems change. Then we'll get into an example from my own practice of what this looks like in reality in terms of the process of systems change. And then we'll get into an exercise that I hope we can all do together, even if we're virtual. So I'm gonna switch to sharing my screen here so I can give you all a few slides. Thank you for bearing with me here. So we will share this and we will go into slideshow. Cool. So I like to start presentations with like the key takeaways that I'd love you to leave with. So in case I get off base or tangential, you all know what I really meant to say today. So I'd like to leave you with my take on some of the core capacities that change makers need to embody today, especially as we're facing super wicked issues around environmental and social challenges. I believe that the core capacities that will enable change makers to thrive and be effective is being able to understand the problems we face from multiple perspectives and always seeking root causes. So that's this thinking in systems piece. I believe that change makers recognize that no one sector or discipline or industry can solve some of these big, hairy issues alone, and that we really need to work collaboratively. We need to understand how to collaborate across disciplines and sectors. And the third one is we must recognize that the world is changing at an unprecedented rate, and the way we tackle challenges or problems must be in an ongoing and adaptive way. We need to manage adaptively. We can't just say, oh, we fixed it and we're done. You know, we need to continually be learning from our interventions and bringing that learning mindset to the work. So those are the key takeaways. And now I'll just get into my spiel here. I can even advance the slide. Okay, so the other like real big point I like to start with is, first I would love to get a sense from you all, what does this word solution mean to you? What are some connotations or conceptualizations that you get when you hear the word solution?
Go ahead, John.
Yes, please.
Resolving an issue.
Resolution, awesome. Yep, resolving. What else you got?
Julian?
Improvements for people.
Say it again.
Some sort of improvement for people.
Improvement.
Improvement, great, great. What else?
Amanda?
Like the compromise.
A compromise.
Oh, interesting. I like that.
Same one. Well, I guess like when you have a problem, obviously there's so many different players and so many different sides. So one solution is not going to like appease every side. Like realistically, like obviously there has to be sort of like a balance. So it's sort of a compromise between the players.
Awesome. You all are like way out ahead. You're at my slide 35 right now. So thank you. Those are really thoughtful answers. I posed often when I put up this slide and ask that question, folks often say things like this idea of resolved or resolute or fixed, definitive. And I think in the context of the challenges that you all are facing in this class and the opportunity spaces that you all are facing in this class, the idea of solution really should be eliminated, in my view. The word itself does not, in my view, have a place when we're talking about systems change. And that gets to the point I was making earlier, that we really need to tackle these issues and opportunities in a way that is adaptive and evolving over time. So the idea of like one and done, great, we solved it, it's fixed. doesn't really exist, because the context and the conditions and the forces of change are always evolving. And so we need to bring a kind of, as I said before, learning mindset to the work. Does that make sense to folks? Cool. So okay, the next thing I'd like to talk about is as you all are bringing insight and problem-solving approaches to some of the issues that Alan has presented with you in the social entrepreneurship class, I think it's often really important when faced with an opportunity or a challenge to really understand the type of problem or challenge you're facing. And science philosopher Karl Popper back in the 70s really posited that there's really two kinds of problems. There's the clock problem and the cloud problem. And the clock problem is a mechanical, linear, simple, sometimes complicated issue. If you're dealing with a clock problem, just as you can think about, you can get into that clock if it's broken, and you can tinker with the gears and you can fix it, right? There is, in fact, a tangible solution to this. You can clearly identify the broken part and you can replace it. You also know that there will be best practices to fixing this type of problem, right? You can look at what's worked elsewhere, what's worked in the past to kind of bring that knowledge forth on this type of problem. And then there is the cloud type of problem. And just thinking as you've perhaps sat under a tree on Brown campus and looked up at the clouds, these are never the same twice, right? Clouds are constantly evolving. They're emergent, right? You've seen them like grow and expand. They're unpredictable and they're adaptive. Folks often call these wicked problems, which is like pulling from the regional dialect there. There's no simple or mechanical fixes here. These challenges evolve over time, as we've talked about. So a strategy that worked in the past may not work today or in the future. And so again, bringing that learning mindset is critical. Can folks think of some types of clock problems? And just sort of shout them out. You don't need to raise your hand. What's a clock problem? What's a really simple, linear kind of challenge that you might face?
Car breaks down.
Car breaks down, bingo. Anything else? Another one that we often like to reference in this type of discussion is a disease that has a vaccine, right? Like polio, for example. We have the tangible solution, the vaccine, to address that particular disease, but the reason we haven't necessarily solved the problem is that getting access to that vaccine, distributing that vaccine, making sure the people who need it have it, that's where you get into the cloud space, right? You get into governance issues across the world and corruption perhaps, and having the right financial resources in place and the right expertise in place, right? That gets a little bit more on the cloud side, but the actual fact that we have a vaccine is a cloud problem. Can folks think about other cloud problems? Just shout them out.
Malnutrition.
Malnutrition, bingo. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
So I don't think it would be as directly solvable as the clock problems, because there's so many factors like you mentioned, corruption, lack of access to resources, distribution of resources.
Totally. Great. Thank you. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, very broadly, but climate change,
Bingo.
massive climate change.
Absolutely. That's very timely, in fact, too. This week is Climate Week in New York. Yeah. Climate change, homelessness, police brutality, all of these issues are cloud problems, right? Context is changing. Our understanding of them are evolving daily. Great, so yeah, without belaboring that, you kind of have a better sense now of the types of problems. And so when you're facing a cloud problem, you know it's a cloud problem, as we talked about, because it demonstrates characteristics of complexity. And this is just some of the characteristics of complexity here: dynamic emergent feedback, that is drawn from complexity theory, which really emerged to describe ecological systems and how even within them they are constantly evolving, but also constantly balancing themselves. So think about an island with a bunch of foxes and a bunch of bunnies, right? Untouched, that the dynamic between those populations, those elements in the system, is demonstrating both balancing and reinforcing feedback loops. When there's a lot of bunnies, the foxes benefit. Their population increases to a point where then the bunny population decreases, right? So you can sort of see how these feedback loops really are apparent in ecological systems. The same is true for the challenges that the cloud problems that we face. And it's really important to kind of identify what those feedback loops are, because they are present, in order to intervene within them, especially if they're producing outcomes that aren't what you're after. Cool. Any questions on that? Does that resonate? Cool. I guess the moral of the story is, like, if you have a clock problem, you just need a really badass project manager. For instance, putting a man on the moon, right? We know how to do that. That is an epic project management challenge, but it is a clock problem. When you're dealing with a cloud problem, you need to bring a systems approach to solving it. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. So I want to start with this really classic iceberg model that's used in systems thinking. I think we read about it a little bit in our readings. I want to kind of quickly walk through the different layers to the iceberg model. And as you all know, the analogy is like 90% of an iceberg exists below the surface of the water, and 10% is what you see above. And so you can look at, you can understand an event as an observable situation, an incident or a behavior, which often appears to be isolated. Often we respond to events in a reactionary way, right? We're like, oh, shucks, that happened, let's deal with it. Less frequently, we take a step back and we say, hey, is this event a part of a bigger pattern? Is this the only situation that's ever occurred like this? Or is it something we can see again and again? And when we take a look at those patterns that are, or trends that are reoccurring or kind of continuous events, we can be aware of that pattern behavior. And then we can respond by anticipating those trends. When we delve a little bit deeper, we understand that patterns are caused by structural forces, be they the policies, the distribution of resources, the physical design of something. And knowing the patterns and what causes them, we can then intervene by designing new structures, by revising policies, by changing physical infrastructure, right? We can address it at a structural level. Even further, the conscious and unconscious thoughts and deeply held assumptions that drive decision-making and keep those structures in place is the mental model, is really understanding what was in someone's mind when they created that structure. What is it about our thinking that creates the systems and supports its persistence? Intervening in our mental models means transforming our awareness. This is where we get into working at the social, like working on the social complexity, working on the individuals, changing mindsets, right? Helping people be more aware of the assumptions embedded in their decisions. And even further, most iceberg models stop at mental model, but the interaction, my buddies at the Interaction Institute of Social Change, which is totally an organization you should check out if this talk today is inspiring, they add cultural and institutional values, and these are definitely the core beliefs and values embedded in our worldview. So this is even deeper than mental models. This is the values that shape and constrain our mental models, but are seldom brought to the surface to be seen, named, or challenged. So these are things like racism or sexism that luckily we're in a day and age where we are surfacing those and calling those out more frequently, but they bring up those conversations bring up discomfort, because most of the time people aren't aware that their mental models, their worldview is based on these underlying cultural values.
Lyndon, I just want to interrupt because I've been thinking about, I'm working on a redesign of our ethics module for this year. And one of the key elements of ethics that we'll introduce as part of that module is the importance of representation of the lived experience and other perspectives. Sort of broadly thinking about having a diverse group of folks engaged in the solving of a problem. And I'm just thinking, just sort of foreshadowing a bit that I'd never really made a direct connect into how that influences cultural and institutional values and how that has an impact on mental models. So
Totally.
for you guys to think about when we get there, coming up next, but just these things all interrelate, and sometimes I'm talking about something before we talk about it, just to sort of put the placeholder out there for you.
Mm-hmm. That's such a great point. And when we call out cultural and institutional values, that's really where we are challenging someone's or an institution's self-identity, right? We're saying you believe you are enacting the values that you promote, but you're in fact not, or you're enacting values that are counter to the values you think you're enacting, right? It's like it rocks you to your core when you call these things out, and it requires. And so the best framework that I have found for having those types of conversations comes out of Harvard Public Policy School, Kennedy School, and it's called adaptive leadership. So if you find yourselves faced with having some of these conversations, whether it's with your parents or your guardians, or your crazy uncle at Thanksgiving or whatever the case may be, like if you are faced with having these really critical conversations around hidden values and value systems, I encourage you all to look at adaptive leadership. It's a really nice communication tool for and framework for these really often difficult conversations. Do we want to run through an example of this, or do we feel like we understand the iceberg model pretty good? We can all think of examples in our head. Does anyone raise your hand if you're feeling like an example would be helpful? You can. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I've got a couple of hands.
Great. Okay, great. So I did prepare an example, and this I kind of switch up the examples every time, but this one I'm hearkening back to the Erin Brockovich movie with Julia Roberts, and from the 90s, if you all remember that or were around then. So this is an instance where the small town of Hinckley, California, was facing at the time a very heightened rate of cancer incidents, and the first community member who fell ill to cancer would be considered an event, right? You react to it with getting them in for immediate care. If you were to delve deeper and say, you know what, is anyone else, do we see any other incidents of cancer in this community? You begin to see the pattern, right? And Erin Brockovich was able to kind of do that, get into the community, interview, and really see that there wasn't just one incidence of cancer, that this rate of disease was higher than most communities. And they were able to deduct that an underlying structure, so a physical piece of infrastructure, again, this can relate to actual physical engineered infrastructure. The PG&E, which is California's largest energy producer and distributor, had a cooling tower system in Hinckley, and they were using hexavalent chromium to produce or to resist corrosion on those physical structures, and that chemical was then percolating into the groundwater and contaminating it. So the underlying structure was the actual act of, hey, we've got a problem, corrosion on our cooling tower. Let's apply this chemical. Let's not necessarily think about the hydrology of this area and how shallow the groundwater is, and that the groundwater is the source of drinking water for this community, right? So getting to the mental models, there was a little bit of ignorance, and maybe intentional, maybe unintentional, around the mental model of like, what are the unintended consequences of us making this decision around our structures? And delving further, you can unpack that the institutional values of PG&E was core to their existence was reduce liability, reduce risk of getting sued. And so that cultural value led to people acting in a way at that institution to deny, deflect, hide evidence of any sort of awareness, right? So those cultural values, that pressure within that organizational system to reduce liability, led people to make really poor decisions. And one of the biggest lawsuits around an environmental justice in our country's history. So that's an example of what this kind of looks like. Does that make sense? Cool. Cool. So as we already touched on, Donella Meadows' definition of a system, and the importance of kind of bringing that neutral view and really understanding, you know what, there are opportunities to redesign how elements of the system are interacting in a way that produces a better behavior outcome over time. I want to make the link between systems thinking, which is again what we've talked about to this date, and systems change. And when you hear the phrase systems change, this is the best definition out there, put together by some practitioners in Canada that form this national network of folks who identified themselves as social innovators or within the social innovation industry or sector. And they talk about systems change is really changing the conditions that hold a problem in place. So as we read in the FSG article, which is one of many sort of frameworks for understanding those conditions that hold the system in place, they do a nice job of breaking it out in terms of things that are kind of easy to and tangible to identify. So you can look at a policy, you can look at a practice, you can look at the sort of infrastructure of something, all the way down to the implicit. So again, very similar, kind of going down into our iceberg model, like looking at these things that aren't often made clear or apparent. I think the semi-explicit are super important, the relationships, connections, and power dynamics. This is really actually where I spend a lot of my time, is unpacking power dynamics in decision-making. Because that's a huge lever for change in the work that I have participated in. So I'm going in the wrong direction here. Cool. So then I would like to talk about what systems change can look like in practice. And I think the keynote here is that it takes forever. No, it's a very time and resource intensive endeavor. Systems change is not on the grant funding time scale. It's not the every 3 to 5 years. It's not something that you can wrap up in a bow in a 5-year strategic plan. It is something that is happening on sort of the decadal time frame, right? Every 10 years is sort of the minimum. I just finished a project with the local community foundation here in Chicago that for the first time ever has decided to invest all of its resource, all of its staff talent, all of its energy towards a single 10-year impact goal, which is to reduce or close the racial wealth gap in Chicago. And they were really astute to say, we need to commit at least 10 years to this, to even see a blip on the radar screen in terms of impact and evidence of that impact. And so we helped them kind of build a strategy around the power dynamics, the social infrastructure needed to get the right people at the table for tackling some of the kind of tactical strategies that they were coming up with. And so I was super grateful to have a client that recognizes that you got to go slow to go fast. And that's sort of the moral of that story. I'd like to just quickly talk through the methodology that's used in practice. This is something we codified at my time at Foresight Design Initiative. And it's this idea that we must first, as we approach a cloud problem, get rid of any preconceptions or notions or assumptions. We need to clear our minds of any early solution ideas, right? Don't jump to ideating what to do. We need to spend time diagnosing the problem, really understanding it from a larger context. We need to convene as many perspectives on the system as possible. So end user to governmental decision maker, right? Everyone in between. Get them in the room and invite their input on mapping the system. The map is a strategic tool that we use to really make explicit and visualize everything from across that iceberg, right? What are the underlying structures? What are the policies that influence the system? What are the mental models? Who has influence over who? What are the power dynamics? And then we can take that view of the system and identify where we want to intervene for the greatest leverage, right? We don't have unlimited, as change makers, we don't have unlimited resources. We don't have unlimited time or money. We need to be really strategic on where we decide to intervene. What do we have capacity for? What do we have the resources for? And sort of prioritize those leverage points. Then we implement, and then we, again, evaluate and refine. This is an ongoing learning journey. So as I mentioned, a really important tool in the system change practice is that of the system map. Some of the goals these are just some of the goals that you associate with the act of mapping a system. And they all really aim to there's many types of system maps. The goals here are really to visually communicate the system elements and the interconnections between them and condense as many perspectives on that system as possible in a very clear, shared way. They can get kind of hairy and often start very hairy. Here's an example of one we did in relationship to that project around closing the racial wealth gap. And you can see that this was multiple weeks, if not months, just to get to this point. But you can see here in the center of the map, we are beginning to identify a core loop, or core feedback loop. That was where we wanted to really focus. It's completely illegible, I understand that. But I think the thing I wanted to call out here is for this one, we used a method that was developed by the Omidyar group, which is another real thought leader on systems change. And they break up the elements of a system in 3 ways. One is the structural, so the physical and social environment in which people live, the natural and built environment, the political, social, economic institutions, the sort of structure, the tangible structures. The second, which is the blue bubbles, is transactional. So this is really looking at the processes used by and interactions among key people, including lobbying, political influence, power dynamics. And then the yellow bubbles here are attitudinal. So this is where we get to the mental models, the widely held beliefs, norms, relations that affect how people think and behave. And so trying to surface those two in a visual way. Anyway, enough about that. So I'd like to walk through a particular example from my practice. This is about 4 or 5 years ago, Foresight was invited to help with the initial organizational development of an emerging collaborative in Chicago. They knew that they wanted, that many stakeholders from across sectors wanted to come together to really solve a complex challenge, which was stormwater and flooding in the Chicago region. We have a combined sewer system for all you engineers out there. And when it rains here, our 100-year-old infrastructure gets overwhelmed pretty much on like the average storm event here. And that leads to raw sewage making its way out into our rivers and streams through combined sewer overflows and basement backup. So literally people with basements in the Chicago region get flooding that's mixed with sewage in their basements, which is a public health concern. So we got an issue here, and it's only going to get worse with increasing frequency and intensity of storm events under climate change. So these folks all were like, you know what, we can't do this by ourselves. We need to come together. We need to figure this out. 40 different organizations showed up to that first meeting. This group is still super active and engaged and really bringing a systems approach to addressing stormwater. One thing we realized really quickly is, as someone mentioned earlier, this idea of compromise and the need for really recognizing that there's so many different perspectives in a room, so many different agendas and motivations for being in that room. And we need to design this process for complexity, for social complexity. And so this is how we define social complexity. It's the diversity of and relationships between stakeholders. And this diverse perspective is based on their experience, their education, their professional focus, or their position within the system. And it's definitely something to have on the radar and be conscious of when you design for a systems approach kind of co-creation process. Here's how it showed up. Here's one example of how it showed up for this particular group. We were there to talk about stormwater, as implied in the name of the collaborative. We were throwing around the word flooding all of the time. And it took us till the third meeting to realize that when one person was saying flooding, they meant basement flooding, and that there are 3 different types of basement flooding that were at play in this region. Other people were talking about overland flooding. So parks and baseball fields, filling up with water, recreational spaces being unusable, roads, streets being impassable. And then others were talking about riverbank flooding. So concerned about those in the flood, with houses in the floodplain that were going to be directly affected by a river overflowing, right? So unpacking that word flooding as we were throwing it around was really important for this group. Again, lots of perspectives and positions within the system. So here's one of 4 breakout groups that we brought together at one of those first couple meetings. And on the back side of the room, you can see a couple flip chart pages that look super messy with a bunch of Post-it notes on them. We just had these breakout groups, again, cross-disciplinary, cross-sectors, map the system together. And that's what their first pass came out as. And that's just one table. So then we had to merge all of the tables, system maps. And I think the green and blue Post-it notes were looking at who has direct influence over the stormwater system. So the pipes, the green infrastructure, the gray infrastructure, and who has influence over those folks with direct implementation ability. And we asked them to look at the system these were the system elements we encouraged them to draw out. Looking at infrastructure policy, where is the knowledge within the system? Who's holding on to the data? That's really important to think about. Who's missing the data that if they had it, they would be making better decisions, right? And then we pulled all of those hand-drawn system maps from across the breakout tables and began to at least make a little bit more clarity sense of it in a visual form. This allowed us to then, again, identify those intervention points. And so here's just a close-up view. One of the things that was important in the center of this map is recognizing that stormwater itself is not a problem, right? The idea of rain falling on our city, rain is a resource. We live on the Great Lakes, water scarcity around the world. We need to be seeing stormwater as like a blessing right now, right? Thinking about Phoenix or whoever else. And that we needed to, again, reframe how we were thinking about this managing stormwater in a way that allowed us to bring a neutral view on it. We actually want to limit the negative impacts of stormwater in the region. We want to maximize the positive impacts, which is, refilling groundwater tables and providing a source of drinking water, right? So that I thought that was important. And then through that system mapping, we identified 8 pain points. We framed it as pain points. Often you hear it talked about as leverage points. These were the things that this group said, these are the reasons why stormwater has negative impacts, and we need to, address these things. We then asked them, okay, you can't tackle all 8. While we do have a lot of organizations around the table, you need to prioritize. Here's a framework for prioritization that we used with them. We looked at what is most pressing. Where is there a sense of urgency around these leverage points? Recognizing who we have around the table today, what do we have collective capacity to do? As change agents, do we have the necessary tools to tackle certain leverage points? What are we most apt and ready to tackle today based on our capacity? And then the third one was impact. If we were to intervene on this leverage point, would we even get close to the desired outcomes that we're looking for? Is there that impact leverage that we're looking for? And so we literally put those 8 things on the wall. We had people vote with sticky dots. We assumed that all of them were urgent because this group identified them. And we said, okay, where is their impact and where is their capacity? And then they narrowed it down to these fundamental challenges. And this has guided their work since this exercise 5 years ago. Any questions on that case study, on this work of systems change? And before we get into an exercise?
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
How similar is the methodology across different challenges organizations? It seemed like it was a pretty structured approach. Is it kind of the same steps that you do every time, same questions that you ask?
Oh, that's a really good question. The thing that I would say that the methodology, generally speaking, those 6 points that I showed earlier, is pretty set. The idea is that we don't want to keep we want to develop a methodology that can be issue agnostic so that we can learn from the methodology itself across different issues. So we're not reinventing the wheel each time, but we're really testing and codifying this method. And so honestly, these 6 steps is pretty ubiquitous. Like, it can be used in a lot of different contexts. Who you bring to the table, how you define the system in terms of getting the system in the room. Obviously, what urgency looks like when you're prioritizing leverage points, and how you evaluate and refine. All of those are variable. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that answer your question? Cool. Other question, that was a great one. Thank you. Does this resonate? Does this like, no duh, we get it? Or is it like, oh, this is kind of interesting? Any insights, any aha moments here? Does this challenge your worldview at all or support it? Does something similar show up in some of your classes?
I had a question, I suppose, specific to this example.
Yeah.
Obviously, you chose 3 of the 8 or 10 maybe critical leverage points. I was just curious, is it ever difficult to get buy-in from people who those might not be leverage points for their organization or their personal experience with the issue? How do you navigate dissonance or biases?
Oh my God, I love this question. Thank you. So absolutely, I think inevitably those 3 leverage points aren't going to resonate with all of these folks around the room, right? There's folks here who are the restoration ecologists and just care about, you know, protecting a certain butterfly species and aren't going to necessarily understand how public and private resources for green infrastructure, you know, like they're not all going to feel personally invested in the leverage points. That in some ways is kind of inevitable, but the process that we went through by giving equal voice to everyone at the table as we develop the system map, by giving equal voice in terms of how we voted on those priorities, helped people realize that they were part of something bigger than their own perspective, bigger than their own organizational mission or agenda. And that's key. You need to help them elevate beyond the frame that they're coming into the room with, because they're here because they want to do something bigger than they can do on their own with collaborators, and they recognize that compromise is inherent. And we design a really inclusive and equitable engagement process to arrive at those leverage points, so they feel like even if we didn't land on their key issue, they were still, their voices were valued, and that when they see if we're really going to tackle this issue that they care about, we need to focus on these areas first. Does that resonate? Yeah.
Go ahead, Connie.
So I know in this example in particular, these are all organizations that opted into this mission. But in the methodology, you said that the second point is getting the system all in the room. When it's in a situation that not every player in the system wants to be involved in the specific mission to make that systems change, what do you recommend or what do you usually do in order to get all of the key players involved?
Awesome question. That's so great. So this comes down, this is where you get to be a little bit more nuanced and specific in your approach. There are, so it depends on the community that you're targeting to be a part of this process. If we didn't have as many private sector representatives around the table, we have learned over just experience that businesses, private sector likes to be engaged with folks of their own kind, right? They're less inclined to join cross-sector initiatives. They're more inclined to talk business to business and align with other businesses. The speak is like more fluid. They understand each other's language. Like there is an inherent affinity and efficiency of engaging them, you know, on their own, and then taking what they develop in systems map and merging it with another conversation that's happening outside. If you're talking about engaging folks with lived experience around stormwater, so folks whose basements flood regularly, they aren't necessarily represented in this collaborative group, but we were able to have those conversations and meet them where they're at versus inviting them to this downtown conference room. We met with some of the organized groups around stormwater across the region and found a way to bring their voice in. And now they send representatives to these meetings regularly. So it's sort of, it takes a little nuance. It requires you to be really adaptive and responsive based on what you're hearing from the different stakeholders that you're hoping to engage. Does that make sense? You kind of, it's all about meeting folks where they're at. If you can't literally get them all in the same room at the exact same time, then create multiple rooms. Does that make sense? Cool.
Lyndon, can I push a little bit further on this question? I imagine that, I mean, like I always, like whenever I see this slide with all the stakeholders, I always, like my head explodes because I just think of herding all of the, you know, figurative cats with different interests and perspectives and even goals. And I can imagine that, number 43, 47, or 52 that aren't on the list might actually be opting out for what might amount to self-interest or other, maybe just characterizing them as political reasons. And I'm curious how you've encountered, whether you've encountered, I'm guessing you must have encountered that, but I'm curious if you've encountered that, and has it ever been like truly an obstacle to like without certain stakeholders in the room or classes of stakeholders in the room that you realize like the process actually isn't that useful?
Yes.
I don't have an example in mind. I'm just
I have loads. That's such a great question. Loads. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I have endeavored to create collaboratives around systems change efforts where we didn't have the key stakeholders we needed to really influence the system, and the effort died. We couldn't move forward without them there. And that's a total reality. However, there's a certain level in this of wanting, if you have, like there's a certain element of this in focusing on the champions of collaborative work, so you can build momentum really quickly. And so luckily the Calumet Stormwater Collaborative and the particular convener who made the call to say, hey, let's do this together, had enough social capital to attract this many folks in the room. This guy, Josh Ellis at the Metropolitan Planning Council, knows everybody in the state, in the region around stormwater. He was able to say, you know what, we're pulling this together, show up, and got folks in the room. I will say, so finding out who the champions are and who the folks with a lot of social capital are, that can cash in on that social capital currency and get folks in the room. I pull up this slide because this gentleman in the far, I'm not sure if it's the right or left for you, but the guy in the far corner of the table who has everyone's attention in this picture was the former head of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Cook County. This guy is literally the head of the institution that manages all of our waste and stormwater infrastructure. And at this meeting, while he sat there at this table while they built the system map, he said, I don't play with markers. So he did not physically pick up a pen and contribute to the system map, but we were able to draw him out a little bit and contribute to some of the insights that were put on the map. He was really skeptical to show up to this first meeting. He would, in private, he was like, you know what? I run the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District. I have complete control over this. I'm the one who can solve this. My organization can solve this problem, right? So the solution mindset. It's like, no, you can't. But he, through one-on-one meetings with him to really allow him to air out his perspective on collaborative work and his perspective on this initiative, was building just enough trust for him to show up to this meeting. And that was what we needed for the time being. He ended up and has since sent a representative from his organization to every single monthly meeting of this group for the last 5 years. So maybe he didn't feel like it was the best use of his time, but he did see value. And now MWRD is working on really awesome pilot projects across this Calumet region for managing stormwater with some of the partners that showed up that are a part of this collaborative. So, it's a little bit of a dance between making people feel heard, understanding their concerns or resistance, being that ear to be like, oh, I totally get it. Could you just show up to this first meeting? It'll be really symbolic and really important to get your perspective, right? Okay, you don't want to play with markers, fine. You don't have to pick up a pen. You don't have to write on a Post-it note. Just speak your mind, right? Like, so it's a nuance and like super delicate dance, but I've seen it totally fail, and I've seen it somewhat work, and I've seen it completely work. So it's it really comes down to who, you know, these individual personalities, honestly.
Yeah, no.
So to just continue on that, how much of the step of getting the system in the room is sort of this like preemption of like conflict or absence? Because it sounds like, you know, a lot of work went into getting this key player on the table. How much of that step is focused on like individual navigation and motivation versus like, you know, trying to actually work in the room? Is that the major piece of it?
Oh, and what was the last part of that? Versus just doing something in the room?
Versus relying on the people who like are, you know, active and really interested to
The
participate.
champions in the room, yeah. So another tactic that's used, especially if you don't have the ability to invest time on a individual basis to get folks to show up to the room. Let's say you do have the champions in the room. They're eager, they understand the value of collaboration, they are like systems thinking, cool, I don't know anything about it, but I want to like play around. You get the champions and you celebrate and promote and announce early wins, early insights, early progress in terms of, hey, you know, we just identified these really important leverage points. Come to the next meeting, be a part of this conversation. Like you can build up a little launch energy that attracts folks who might have not wanted to invest early on. They're like, wait, there's a room that I'm not a part of, and it seems like they're talking about really interesting things. I better show up, right? So you can kind of generate that energy that gets them to show up over time. And I always say, you will have turnover. You will have to manage turnover when you're dealing with these long-term processes. You'll always be wanting to strive for greater and greater inclusiveness. So you won't always get the full system in the room on that first time. As long as you are continually striving for inclusiveness over time, that's key.
Grace?
I have a question about, it's kind of jumping off Talia's point a little bit, so talking about these important stakeholders that you really have to kind of figure out the stance of getting them in the room. And I'm curious if in that process, you ever make compromise before you even get to the discussion table in terms of like things that they'll be willing to give up. And then kind of from that, how you find the balance between, okay, is it more important to have these stakeholders given the compromise and have them be a part of the conversation, or is it more important that we get to have a truly blank slate and have all of the people that are invested in coming up with like an innovative solution because they're invested in this process and invested in this outcome? I guess I'm curious how you, I assume there's a balance there, and I'm curious how you navigate.
I love that question, and I hope I'm going to try to answer it, and you just let me know if I fully understood or nailed it. So I am someone who believes that process is the most important factor in outcomes, and that if you design the process right, I strive for getting as many voices and perspectives, even if they are the resistors at the table, because I believe the design of the process can help change their minds, can help them see their work in a greater context, and help see the problem they're trying to solve as being shared by others, even if they're working on a different piece of the system. And that realization, that awareness building is like a critical step in my mind. And so I do tend to, even if I have to fight really hard to get the resistors in the room, I do think that they leave with a greater perspective than they walked in the room with. And that's because of the process that's being designed. Is that a direct answer? Another thing that I'll say is one of the first things we did with this group is have them, as they were literally picking up their name tags, walking into the room for this first meeting, we had them in that awkward time at the start of a meeting, like the 10 to 15 minutes where some people got there too early, some people are running late. there's like some awkward mingling. Oh, how are you? How are your kids? Blah, blah, blah. Like I usually try to take advantage of that pre-meeting 15 minutes, 20 minutes and have an exercise on a wall where folks are giving me input. Like that is valuable time for me to collect information and I'm going to use it. And that gives them something to do and kind of look at each other's answers and da-da-da. So post-it note prompt on the wall. And for this one, we said, why are you here? What are you hoping to get out of this meeting, this process? And we got a ton of ideas. I didn't include the slide on this, but I have a whole list of the motivations for why people participated. And then I was able to use that list of 20 some items and design every meeting after to touch on those motivations. So that even if people were just there to socialize or to get out of the office or to find a funder or whatever the case may be, we were creating opportunities to meet everybody's needs, as well as my own agenda for getting them to think in systems.
Go ahead, Maggie.
So I have a question, like
Yeah.
3 points that they identified as like leverage points. But I'm interested in like how like that's been implemented because you said it's been happening for like 5 years, right?
Yeah.
And like who is actually like paying for those things to happen or like making them happen?
Great question. Oh my God, the funding piece is so critical to this. So nailing it with that practical question. So this particular group, the Calumet Stormwater Collaborative, was initially funded for the first 3 years by the Chicago Community Trust. And that's that same organization I just finished the strategic plan with, who understand the value of collaborative work and understand that if you're really gonna affect massive wicked problems, you need to invest over long periods of time. So it wasn't a 1 year grant, it was a 3 year grant, which is like kind of the best we can do in Chicago. Then another local funder called the Joyce Foundation, who also has a interest area in water, was like, hey, this is really cool. There's some buzz happening. They got the right people in the room. Then they are now the long-term funders of this work.
Brown alumna, by the way.
You know them?
No, I don't. My old boss was a colleague. Remind me her name, the woman who ran that foundation for a long time.
Oh yeah, I'm blanking on it right now, actually.
Anyway, she's a Brown alumna.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, and they have a big education focus area too, for your eye-to-eye work. But the Joyce Foundation, I just saw on Twitter this week, there's a big annual conference for all these water system engineers called WEFTech, and the Joyce Foundation did a workshop on funding collaborative work. So they're very proud of the Calumet Stormwater Collaborative, and they're trying to get others excited about this collaborative work. Again, it takes funders who are thinking in the long term, and they are few and far between, I'm afraid. But one of my side jobs has been to help raise awareness with the local funding community in Chicago of the value of this work and help make the case for it, because it is, as I've touted already, like really the only way we're gonna, you can have a funding area on addressing homelessness or immigrant integration or education, but unless you're really you're fostering systems thinking and collaborative work, you'll be funding that indefinitely. There will never be progress, in my view. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm listening to this and finding it very interesting. And you talk about going slow to go fast. Mm-hmm. But obviously 10 years is like a long time to not do anything. So I wonder what change looks like when a system itself is changing. Like you talk about decision makers and how the power dynamics are altered and are questioned. How does change happen when those things are being fundamentally questioned?
Awesome. Oh, great question. Thank you. So I can point to an example of a collaborative that I've also been involved in supporting their systems change work, which is Elevated Chicago. This is a 17-member organization collaborative that's focused on driving equitable outcomes for transit-oriented development. So for the last 10 years, Chicago has had a really progressive transit-oriented development zoning policy on the books, but it has led drastically to gentrification and displacement of local, of folks who've lived in the area for a long time. This collaborative has come forth, and while they are funding both direct design build projects on 7 pilot sites across the city, they're also investing a lot of energy on changing the discourse and pointing out segregation in Chicago, pointing out the causes of displacement, both gentrification and underinvestment of communities. They are changing the discourse of how we think about development, community development, economic development in Chicago, and they've been around for only 3 years. They are really moving the needle. We just had a mayoral election last February, and they were able to get on the mayor's, the top 2 candidates' agendas in terms of really emphasizing and leading with equitable development across the city. And now some of the members of the original members of Elevated Chicago are now the chief equity officer of the city of Chicago. They're the new housing department commissioner. They're the new deputy commissioner of the housing department. They have penetrated by building this social capital, changing discourse, infiltrating, local government and other institutions. And this is like the best example of changes actually being catalyzed much faster than the 10-year horizon. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah. But I think, it's like pulling those champions, getting them involved, propagating the message, and it's super exciting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, gee, I'm afraid we only have 5. Is it true we only have 5 minutes left?
Yeah.
Okay.
One more question.
Yeah.
Maybe from Julian, and then I think we are going to have to wrap up, sadly.
Okay.
Today for many more hours if you have time. Go ahead, Julian.
I'm just curious about kind of what phase. This is a really cool project, but is this the typical project that you do? Do you work a lot with actual organizations about, I know you mentioned earlier, kind of understanding how decisions are made within the power structure? So what's the distribution of the types of projects that you do?
Oh, what a great question. Thank you. I would say it's probably 50-50 collaborative based work, so where you have multiple sectors coming together, and then 50 inter-organizational work that is an organization who's interested in integrating a systems approach in their practice and helping them navigate the power dynamics within and the hierarchical systems within an organization and the dynamics between stakeholders within an organization. Does that answer your question? I find both uber fascinating and incredibly exciting and challenging. I'm really blessed to do this work. It's it feels like the most exciting stuff to do. And every project is a new, is a huge learning curve. It's a different issue. It's a different set of stakeholders. And you get to just really understand the human condition in a way that maybe you hadn't before. I hope that you all feel free to reach out at any point to me. We can take this conversation offline. I'm happy to point you in the direction of great organizations to get internships with, or whatever the case may be. It's always so fun to talk to this super inspired and interesting and dynamic group. So thank you for your time today. I'm grateful.
Lyndon, thank you. Every time I spend time with you, I walk away with new ideas that sort of enrich my own understanding of this work. And I am so grateful for you to continue to teach me while you teach them. 2 takeaways for me that were really powerful, just little phrases, that go slow to go far, was one that Jack already mentioned. The other one was a definition I don't think that you had shared previously, the shifting conditions that hold the problem in place. We've used different language to talk about the same thing in this class, but I really appreciated that. But I think mostly what I wanted to just sort of call out is, and this came up in the conversation we had last week about eye to eye, but also so many times today, is that you literally walk the walk that you do in your work. And just one tiny example was in the when Lyndon was introducing today, like in her opening comment, she talked about the co-creation of this lesson, right? And I think that when you really sit back and think about what Lyndon's work is about, what your work is about, sorry, you're over there. I should have followed that. What your work is about is this idea that you are facilitating the co-creation of new ideas, solutions, innovations, whatever you want to call them. And I have just benefited so greatly from your collaboration on this project. And I just want to also thank the students today, like the questions that you asked sort of pushed, just pushed the conversation well beyond where we started today. This is not simple stuff. And there's no answers here. This is a process. And Lyndon, I just want to thank you for exemplifying that process, being my teacher and teaching today's talk. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan.
I will talk to you tomorrow. Just so you know, there were a couple people that weren't able to make it today that, so I've asked Lyndon for permission to record the session. I will be posting that somewhere in a Google Drive and posting a link so you can look at it if you want to go back to see what you didn't have. And also, Lyndon, if it's okay, can you send the slides as you did? There are a couple new, a lot of them are similar to last year, but a few new ones with some goodies in there. So you don't want to have to go. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks, Lyndon. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, it's right there. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah.
Right.
So so the answer is because I don't have any problem, but if we think about that, so we've got this is substantive. Right. Yeah, and that's the challenge, and it's not like, oh, we don't want to do more work. is that literally, how can I, like, I know enough about all the organizations on that list, just enough to sort of like have context for being in conversation with you. I might not know the answer, but I can ask a question that sort of challenges you to go further. So I suspect his answer is going to be yes, but it will be about his comfort doing that. But I think that actually would be awesome.
Okay, I'll
Right.
talk about it. The second thing was,
And then I can pick it up.
software that she, or I don't know software, but that she used.
The mapping, yeah.
Yeah, is free. And, and for another class, yeah, in my undergrad, we actually have to do second snaps, for the project. And like you have, I think, one free.
Yeah.
But like I made this one out, inequality, a few other things, and I've actually trying to using it there, develop one for something else. You can only make one for free. But in general, in the future, or just in general, if like it's interested, like it is free.
Can you just send me the name of that?
I can.
She mentioned it offhand, and I actually wrote myself a note to ask her about that.
Yeah, it's called Kumu.
What's it called?
I'll send you an email. KUMU. It's called Kumu.
Oh, I've come across that before.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've never had, like done a project where I wanted to use it, but.
Yeah, because I will say if there's a learning curve, and it's once you get it, you're good.
Right.
And also, I feel like in general, I know for some students in the class, the two learning curves at once, the one of just trying to understand structural thinking, and then the learning curve of the software was a lot.
Yeah.
So like for me coming in, I was like, something to finally like display all of like the complexities of systems thinking, like systems thinking, and it was really awesome.
And I, you know.
And you can even show like I did all like pluses and minuses as well as directions. So like,
So it's talking about
coming in-
what kind of.
Exactly. And there's like a whole, you know, all the programs you make, like community mapping, but then there's also like systems mapping. So like, you know, you can do ones that are just like all the different organizations involved, all the stakeholder mapping, like all of that. You can do all of that on here. I have not. This is what I've mainly used it for, because I find that stakeholder mapping and those things, like the second I start doing that, I end up wanting to do like I want to do something like a community map, because I'm like, oh, I don't want to just, I want to.
Yeah, and I don't know, yeah, it's.
I will.
I've never done